Hello, welcome to another edition of the Florida Chamber's Bottom Line. I'm David Hart, Executive Vice President at the Florida Chamber of Commerce, and our guest today is Representative Jamie Grant from House District 64 in Tampa. Representative, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, David.
So last year, I want to talk about last session first because you were a chief architect and a real champion to protect our Constitution along with Representative Renner. And that piece of legislation was an attempt to protect our Constitution, improve our petition gathering process, and really add more information and clarity to voters on what they were voting on in these constitutional amendments. But I know you're working on a 2.0 version of that, so tell us what's in store this year.
Yeah, so I think when you look at kind of what happened last year, David, obviously the House product that Paul and I had worked on was a little bit more about transparency on the ballot, letting voters understand that maybe there were terms that were ambiguous or maybe even things that were unconstitutional being put on the ballot. A lot of people don't realize you can actually proposed to repeal the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and the state constitution, and it would go all the way through the process until lawsuits happened after the fact. The reality is our Constitution shouldn't be a place it shouldn't be a playground of politics. It should be a founding document of our Charter of Liberties. And so what we started on last year was a process to create as much transparency as possible. The Senate was a little more focused on the petition gathering process, which we also felt like was a problem. But last year's product kind of erred a little bit more towards the petition gathering process. This year, I think you'll see a lot more in the way of transparency as far as educating voters on what they're voting on, the consequences. Understanding that it may require a tax raise, it may require a cut in government services from other places, and that there may be things in there that are either legally ambiguous or legally insufficient or even unconstitutional, such that people have a better idea of the consequence of their vote when they're voting on something as sacred as our Constitution.
Well, we fully support what you're trying to do to protect our Constitution and not make it a playground for things that can be handled in legislation. So thank you for your leadership there. I also want to ask you about House Bill 1 for the 2020 session. You are the sponsor this year for House Bill 1, which attempts to put some additional transparency and protections in place for workers as it relates to their relationship with a union. Talk a little bit about what you're after there. Why is it important?
Well, I think when you look at classical liberalism or the school of Bastiat, which I subscribe to wholeheartedly, we always put the individual first, right? And in this scenario, we have a state worker who's working hard, who's getting paid for their wages. And what we're simply saying is, before they are compelled or obligated or even bullied to join a union, and their paycheck has part of it garnished to go to that union, that we ought to ensure, the employer ought to ensure that somebody wants money coming out of their paycheck going to a union before that happens. And then simultaneously, that when somebody wants to opt out of a union, they can do so in a way that doesn't compel them to maybe face retribution or blowback. We've had some scenarios where a teacher is told that in order to withdraw from a union, they need to go down to the union office between 8 and 3 on a weekday. Well, that's kind of when a teacher should be in the classroom, right? It's clearly an effort to prevent that teacher from making their own choice. The one that's the most offensive to me, David, that came up was a union that on the registration form actually asked the party affiliation. And I don't think in any scenario asking party affiliation in the public or private sector is appropriate. I've never been asked that being hired. I've never done that in the hundreds of hires I've made, and I find it patently offensive. And so we're just simply saying here that the worker should come first. And there's no doubt that we have some labor unions that serve a purpose and do a good job on behalf of our workers. But I think it's equally true that in a lot of scenarios they go way too far and end up increasing prices for us as consumers, end up suppressing wages for the people they represent by what they do. And so we're going to try and create as much transparency and efficiency in that process as possible because at the end of the day, a worker who has earned their paycheck ought to be able to either freely opt into something, an organization that they support, or easily opt out of an organization that they no longer support.
Last question for you, Chair Grant, has to do with innovation. You have long been a leader during your time in the legislature in the space of welcoming new innovations and cutting-edge technologies to Florida. I know you're working on some things this year in that space. It's your passion. Tell us what you got cooking.
Yeah, so I think we're trying to kind of enhance what was done last year. A lot of people aren't familiar with the United States Digital Service, but it's doing some really great work at the federal level We are unfortunately so far behind in the state of Florida. That's the bad news. The good news is I think we're so far behind, we're ahead. We haven't sunk a ton of money into antiquated assets. We do have a lot of antiquated assets, but in the recent time period, we have not really invested in smart digital strategy. The governor has been very vocal about wanting to have a fintech sandbox. So when we think about financial technology and how we can eliminate some of the barriers and expedite the deployment of innovative financial tech, that's obviously a big deal. So we're working on that as part of the package. And then we're trying to create for the first time the Florida Digital Service. It would kind of work akin to the U.S. Digital Service. It would be the first attempt to really put an enterprise architecture, and I know that's kind of a nerdy thing, David, but tech policy really isn't all that different than how we interact on a daily basis. In normal business, the same principles apply. So we need to know what data we have. We need to know where we keep it, what we call it, who has access to it, and who moves it. It's not a secret that our elections are under attack, and it's not a secret that we can't communicate across silos of government. The solution to keep our state data secure, our elections sacred and secure, is really the same solution to let us go on offense and start delivering tangible value to our consumers, our constituents. And so it's a passion of mine, a project of mine. You'll know we've gotten there when you have access to a digital driver's license for the first time that's secure and authenticated. I hope this is the year we get that done.
Representative Jamie Grant, thank you for your partnership with the Florida Chamber of Commerce. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us on another edition of the Florida Chamber's Bottom Line.